Check those clocks, morning, noon, or night, dumb or smart watches. It is a time to think. Not dumb or smart people, Chris.
Yeah, I didn't know where you're going with that, Josh.
Everyone who listens is a smart people.
Because they're taking the time to think.
Yeah, if you set aside time to think.
You ain't dumb.
Yeah, it's like, so Proverbs says in the introduction, let the wise hear and increase in learning. And the idea is, if you want to be wise, know that you got to increase in learning.
And we are here to help you increase in learning.
Yeah,
you are therefore wise.
We'd like to think so.
Yeah, we'd hope so.
So yeah, the Proverbs mindset is if you want to be wise, know you got to get more wisdom. And hopefully if you're listening to A Time to Think, you thought, I need a good wisdom. If you want
Maybe a good laugh. Maybe a good laugh.
If you want a good laugh,
yeah?
A video that I think only 2 people that I've ever met find funny, and one of them is Brogan Arstead. It's called Dog of Wisdom, and it is just stupid, but it is hilarious. And it's just a dog making noises, a cartoon dog, and giving you wisdom. So if you need more wisdom, you can search Dog of Wisdom on the YouTubes.
Wow. Well, thanks, Brogan.
And that's the end of this episode, because that's all the wisdom we've got, right?
Yeah, we just covered a digital liturgy, which is looking for random videos on the internet.
Yeah.
I excel in this. I enjoy it quite a great deal.
Here's actually a good, just in case people are getting a little
ready
bit
to turn
tired
it off.
of Josh Holland's critique of the internet. Chris and I just watched a video together, and it was great. And actually, over the course of Chris and I's friendship, we have had different iterations of what our Mondays look like.
Yeah, that's correct.
And what Josh Holland has grown to learn to grow, grown to know, whatever, is not how to speak well, but
learn to grow.
How to find relational pockets that are not productive with
Chris. I have many unproductive relational pockets.
So I think if left,
I have the equivalent of cargo pants of unproductive pockets. Josh has what do you have?
There's no room
Spanx.
for extra.
You have Spanx, yeah. Not a pocket in sight. I've got pockets everywhere.
So if left to our own druthers, we walk into the same room and Josh is thinking business, productivity, let's get some stuff done, and Chris is thinking, what's up, man? And so when we combine forces, when we touch, is it Thundercats where there's like the rings?
Thundercats! Oh!
You touch the Thundercat rings, we become one full person.
Oh, man.
Play and productivity.
It's like Captain Planet and Voltron and all those things.
So we just watched a really funny video from SNL with circling around Beavis and Butthead. That was our relational moment for the day, and that is an example.
Childhood years brought to the fore.
That is an example of how you can share an experience with technology, right? I saw the thing on the internet. I shared it with my friend, and it actually bonded us a little bit.
It did.
Got a good laugh.
It was great.
Yeah.
It was great. It was wonderful. So.
Did you watch Beavis and Butthead growing up?
Yes, I did.
Yeah. I don't know. Is that an appropriate show?
Well,
I haven't seen it.
No, it's not. I mean, my parents. I don't think my parents wanted me to watch it, but I did because everybody else did that I was my age. So it was stupid. It was really stupid.
Well,
terribly
one of the
stupid.
Is named.
Yes.
So
I know. Yeah. Well, anyways, if you're still listening right now,
this is a time to think.
We're gonna think together.
We're going through a book called Digital Liturgies by Samuel James. Digital means what you think it means. Media
dealing with your fingers, correct?
Yes, exactly. No. Dealing with things online, particularly the word ubiquity comes up quite often. Things that you can hold in your pockets and your hands that are on tables.
I told you fingers already. Hands, digital. Come on, Josh.
Liturgies is the
one. Be straight with us here.
Maybe people are either less familiar with or have an aversion to. Liturgy simply means something that trains you in a certain type of way.
Yeah.
So let's say that, back in the day, DMC Wausau had a very, very simple liturgy. It was some sort of greeting, 3 songs, sermon, 2 songs, bye. Well, it's still a liturgy.
It is a liturgy.
It trains you. Like, you don't come in and expect sermon right off the bat. You expect a greeting. You don't expect 2 songs, you expect 3 songs. So you're being trained to expect a certain thing, and you're being trained into a certain type of person.
Right.
Now, if you grew up in a different tradition, you might be trained to expect a reading, and then
we both grew up in those traditions, liturgical traditions, yeah.
What most of our people affectionately call that place with all the up downs.
Right.
Sitting and standing, sitting and standing.
Yep.
But that's a liturgy as well, and Samuel James is taking that idea of liturgies, something exterior to us that shapes us in a certain way that we grow to expect, and mapping it onto digital age. So we've talked a lot about foundational stuff, and now the next 5 chapters are about specific liturgies. I kind of said at the end of the last podcast, none of us are going to fully feel each of the 5. There might be 1 or 2 that really go, oh, that hits hard. We should look for ways in which the other 3 are affecting us, and also keep our ears out for how it's affecting the culture, because if we really want to engage with people who don't yet believe the gospel, we need to see how people generally are affected by the age, so we can invite them into something different. Chris, you outed me on the last podcast as a control freak, as a type A.
You kind of did that to yourself, man.
You started.
Your wife did that. Everyone's doing that.
Yeah, everyone's outing me. So it is a humbling thing to admit that I don't have a plan for this podcast other than to just read some quotes and talk about it.
Let me take over, my friend.
A little naked without a plan.
I will ride this thing all the way home.
So here's the shaking and trembling Josh, just reading some quotes from the book and talking about it. Chapter 4 is called My Story, My Truth. We've talked about relativism before.
Right.
I think that most of our people listening would not say, well, I have my truth and you have your truth. But we are baked in a culture where we're taught that. Yep. Right? We talked about this with the idea of non-confrontationalism, that it can be really hard to just look at someone and say, hey, actually, that's wrong. Because the whole ethos of the culture has been say, no, Chris can believe what Chris believes.
Right.
Josh can believe what Josh believes. Now, James is saying that this my story, that would be experientialism. Like what Chris has experienced is the most important. Doesn't matter what statistics say about demographics. What have I experienced?
Sure.
So he opens up with kind of a fictional tale of a narrative that describes divorce as bad.
Okay.
But then there's a student in the class, in this literature class, that raises his hand and says, well, my experience has been that it was actually good for our family. My parents grew out of love and they separated and it's been better. Well, the point of that is that the student has their experience, and that experience comes to trump, could be statistical reality.
Yep.
A lot of statistics are coming out these days about the happiest subgroup in America demographically is women that are married with kids. And we can at the same time say... I mean,
both of our wives can attest to that, right?
How happy they are. We can at one and the same time say that God does not give children and marriage to everyone, that in His sovereign hand He sometimes withholds a good thing for a purpose that sometimes is mysterious, and also that God's good design in general is marriage, covenant union, fruitful and multiply. And we're seeing statistically that that's the case. Now, the current culture would say, but my story is... So, well, what does your story have to say according to demographical analysis?
Right.
And that's the problem here that James is picking up, is that we don't live in a culture that would say, oh, the demographical analysis will dictate how I think about what's good and bad.
Right.
It's my story, my experience. Any reflections first on that idea of my story or my truth trumping the external reality?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think it's... I'll wade into these waters right now because why not? So something I've been struck with, I mean, my politics are my politics, and I need to be careful. I'm not going to advocate for a candidate or anything like that. But
not a time to stump.
Yeah, exactly. What I will say I found interesting is that the current administration has overseen a particular type of period of American history that has been less than pleasant for the vast majority of people economically, right? And what I've seen...
You're thinking in terms of inflation, stuff like that.
Oh yes, inflation, everything. It's been relatively nightmarish. What has been interesting to me is, as I've seen campaigning going on by the current administration, they have repeatedly, instead of using facts and figures, hauled out the idea of individual stories of somebody saying, well, I'm better off. Like I saw a New York Times columnist, Paul Krugman, who he's an economist. He's been doing this for a long time, okay? And he tweeted something out, apparently, this past week that said something to the effect of, contrary to what all of these conservatives are saying, the economy is great and it's a miraculous recovery story. And so this is the New York Times, right? I mean, like this is the paragon, at least in the world of journalism. This is the paragon of print journalism in the United States. I mean, if you're writing for the New York Times, you've arrived.
You're talking Washington Post, New York Times.
Exactly.
But New York Times more so.
Yeah, and so they're way up there. And when you have an individual like that who's coming out and saying, now here's what he said. This is a guy who is known for economic analysis that tends to be, whether you agree with his school of thought economically, he's still a thoughtful individual, right? And what he tweeted out was something to the effect of, all the people I know are doing fine. Now, for me, I'm thinking, Paul, all the people you know are super wealthy Manhattanites.
Sure.
That's who you know.
Yeah.
You don't know everybody in this country, but people...
Not friends with a ton of people in Merrill.
Exactly. And they're not friends with a ton of people down in the border, between Mexico and the United States. Like, all kinds of different things that are going on here that people have concerns with, that people's lives are being, radically impacted right now by current policies. And Krugman comes out, and instead of using facts and figures, talking about inflation, which, again, it rose again. It's like year over year is like 3.4, 3.5% inflation now again, even though the current administration is telling us, oh, it's fine, it's under control, this kind of a thing. Krugman comes out and says, I and the people I know are doing fine.
Yeah.
And now we, as consumers of media, are being made to think, well, if an economist like Paul Krugman is doing fine and his friends are doing fine, maybe I'm the outlier.
Yeah.
Because they're telling me that their experience is this, so I should believe them, I should trust them instead of looking at facts and figures.
Yeah.
So.
No, that's good, because that's a time where anecdotal evidence trumps statistical reality.
Mm-hmm.
Now, there are a lot of really important things that can't be borne by statistics, but this is just,
right.
there are some times where statistics can run up against anecdotal evidence, and you want to take that seriously.
Mm-hmm.
And I think where the my story, my truth thing leads us is that anecdotal evidence trumps statistical reality. It's not that,
right.
We would say anecdotal evidence is important.
It's helpful, yeah.
But I think where James is going is that we have bought into a culture through social media, and what we'll talk about is the democratization of information, where everyone's opinion is equally valid.
Yeah.
Expertise is dropped low. That therefore Josh's story, Josh's experience can trump whatever the statistical outside reality is. And more so that Josh is actually afraid at the idea that his experience can be challenged.
Yeah.
Now I'll give you, this is a minor example, but I read a lot of different books, and sometimes psychological principles will be referenced, and I feel them to be true. But I will say, as a leader of a church, I'm often thinking, if I say that from the pulpit and two of the counselors, trained therapists in my room, if they think that's wrong, I'm going to sound like an idiot, right? Now I have this decision here. It's like, I feel it to be true. The anecdotal evidence tells me that it's true, but I don't really know anything about cortisol levels. And so you experienced one today where I just pulled a brother aside and said, is this true? I feel it to be true, but you have an external objective reality about these different types of things.
And your body felt cortisol rushing before you asked the question.
It did, because even this small idea I had bought into such a degree that I wanted it to be true. But I had to take a risk that he would say, actually, that's false, and here's why. And then I would go, oh, so whatever time I spent thinking about that was worthless. And that's the danger, and that's an unimportant thought. Yeah. It was just a thought from a book. But when it's a lived experience, if you have lived with an idea about yourself for 5 or 10 years, we know this when we're talking to non-believers, it is really hard to relinquish something. And so the democratization of the internet, you can always find, let's say you're questioning your faith, you can always find confirmation bias.
Right.
And so the democratization of information and the leveling of expertise, it makes it even harder for me to ever risk my experience being thwarted by reality.
Right. Yeah, and I would say, I just want to even push back a little bit from a Christian perspective. There are some unhealthy movements within evangelicalism that have been based upon this type of thing, right? Like the idea that my personal experience trumps Scripture, right? So something that's baked into Christianity that has been prized, at least from the Bible's conception until the present, is the idea of things that have been written down with the authority, the divine authority that God gives it, as being binding, right? Like there's a normative existence that we dwell in, that from the beginning of time, from God's command to Adam and Eve, to the injunction to not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, that there are boundaries that are based in fact and objective reality that the individual's experience no matter how you might feel about it. If Eve is like, yeah, but this would feel really good, all right? Somebody's telling me something, and it's not true, right? But the appeal is to, you feel a certain way, and well, maybe this and maybe that, whatever. It's always been bound upon the human condition to look at objective facts and to live accordingly. I mean, that's how God has made us. He's made us human beings to do that. So part of fallenness and how the fallenness of this world operates is to try to convince us that we can rage against facts. Like, we can rage against objective normative things. Like, something could be obviously true, right? Like, on paper, obviously true. And it could sit there in front of us, and as long as we're persuaded internally, or as long as we can help persuade somebody else, it doesn't matter, right? And so, like, this problem is as old as the fall of man. I mean, this problem is 7,000 years old for us here. We go back to the beginning of human history, and what we find is that God He has spoken clearly, and He has given us, and what even happens, right, when Adam is created? The animals are brought to Him for what purpose? The animals are brought to Him in order that they might be named. Right, and so, like, there is something that there's an authority that's just baked into human experience. It's like definition matters, definition matters, but not definition that's based on how you feel about something. Is that you look at this and this is what it is, right? Like, this is a lion, all right? A lion is a lion. This is a bear. A bear is a bear. And as we've kind of progressed throughout human history, we've always had this idea that we keep coming back to, which is I'm free to determine for myself. And we spent an entire several months talking about, Carl Truman's book, Strange New World, that it's really kind of been celebrated now for the past 250 years, this idea that human experience, subjective, quote, truth, is really what's most significant. There is no objective truth. So
Yeah. So James talks about in this idea of how objective truth intersects with our own lived experience. He talks about Jonathan Haidt's work. Jonathan Haidt wrote a book called The Coddling of the American Mind, Jonathan Haidt is not a Christian. I like interacting with him because he's one of those guys that tends to agree with some Christian realities, even though he doesn't agree with Christ. So it's easy to look at him and say, look, it's even the non-believer is seeing what we're seeing. He works at NYU as I think he was called a social psychologist. So he does some sociology, some psychology, and he wrote a book called The Coddling of the American Mind, which was basically saying that there's this theory called cognitive behavioral therapy where you intake thoughts, you weigh thoughts, and then you determine what you're going to do with thoughts, right? You train yourself to deal with external factors that come into you, which is the exact opposite of like the birth of safe spaces in universities, which is here's a space where you can't be affected at all by thoughts.
Right.
So cognitive behavioral therapy says here's how to deal with the thoughts so they don't affect you in certain ways. Safe spaces say here's how to not be affected at all by hiding. And James quotes Haidt by saying there is no expectation that students will grow stronger from their encounters with speech or text that they label triggering. The authors Haidt and Greg Lukianoff, they offer a complex, nuanced explanation of why this culture of fragility came about. The factor that I want to reflect on most of all is the role that technology has played, especially millennials and younger, to be the kind of people who are likely to feel aggrieved or upset by disagreement.
Sure.
If we look hard at the epistemological habitat of the internet through the eyes of wisdom, we will see the privileging of personal experience as ultimate truth is not just something we find online, it's the very logic of the social internet itself. So James is saying the social internet, which he kind of tries to expand not just social media, but expand it into things like YouTube. The social internet where people are disseminating ideas trains us to be the type of people who get really upset at the idea of being wrong. Really, not just bummed at being wrong, but mad, and therefore stiff-arming even the chance. How have you seen that play out, Chris?
Oh, boy. How have I not seen that play out?
I see it. I'll give you one example. I see it in kind of diversion tactics. So what happens easily on Facebook in arguments is someone makes a claim, and then someone debunks or disputes that claim, and then the conversation changes topics.
Sure.
Because we're not actually going to interact about whether or not the first claim was wrong.
Right.
This is about winning.
Right.
Right. And so the fear of losing is greater than the desire to think through a topic.
Right.
And so I have to win. So I'll divert this over here or character attack over here. And so whatever the actual argument, it never actually gets argued or weighed out. Because the experience of being right is more important than the truth.
Yeah, I mean, I think unfortunately, I mean, it's just observable in any comment thread that you find on a news website, whatever it might be. I mean, pick your news website that allows comments, but they all tend toward like, somebody will say something and then somebody will come back with an inevitable talking point that says like, oh, well, you all are this, or you're all bad, or whatever, and it just proliferates all around the internet. I mean, you can post something, and if there's any type of visibility in it, it's going to draw a certain type of response that is based on assumptions, preconceived notions, presuppositions that haven't been vetted. The idea that somebody has a different idea than you do. It's proliferating everywhere. Like if somebody has a different idea and you're not in agreement with it, then it's your responsibility to let them know that they're wrong. It's no longer about, and I think this is an interesting thing to just kind of think about history of thought. Like the liberal arts education is an historically Christian concept, right? And so you see in the Reformation this idea of we want to pursue truth, because if the world is based on truth, on God's truth and His Word, and His Word is prioritized, because what had happened with Roman Catholicism is the Roman Catholic Church had said, well, we are arbiters of the truth.
Right.
Right.
We're the gatekeepers.
Yeah, we're the gatekeepers. And so
which, by the way, can I pause you? Because this is something that comes to mind, gatekeepers. People tend modern times to think of the Pharisee as the people who like law too much. But if you don't just think of Pharisees as fundamentalists, but you think of them as gatekeepers, it's really helpful to transmit that throughout societies.
Yeah, exactly.
So the Roman Catholics were the gatekeepers.
Right.
Right now, really, progressives are the gatekeepers.
Correct.
And so it's too easy to say, well, religious fundamentalists are the gatekeepers. Culturally speaking, the powerful gatekeepers right now are liberal theologically or progressive in movement.
Correct.
And so we're looking not just for who has the most strict laws, but who says what's right and wrong, who keeps the gates.
Yeah, absolutely.
And you're saying there's this happening in the Roman Catholic Church.
Yeah, so look at what happened with Galileo, right? Like Galileo was observing some things that seem scientifically provable, all right? Actually provable, not like a theory, like evolution is a theory, but provable, all right? The idea of the earth revolves around the sun, okay? And the idea is, well, it's silence. That's silence. That's silence. That's silence. Is there a place for fact? Now, I mean, that's an archaic argument. It's an older argument. But what it, I think, does reflect is that there's a tradition in humanity, or you talk about the gatekeepers, that then kind of gets blown up, because what the Bible does is it says truth belongs to God. And so if truth is true, we want to discover it for God's sake. Because He is the one who runs the show. He defines everything. And so the explosion you see in education past the 16th century is an explosion that's been born out of this Reformation concept that the world is the Lord's, the fullness thereof, right? Everything is His. And so it is incumbent upon Christian people to look at this world and come to conclusions based on facts. And what you've seen with the diminishing of the Christian influence on education, the Christian worldview specifically on education, is that now you're seeing leak back into the culture the idea of, well, narratives must be preserved. Narratives must be preserved, and the narratives must be preserved at all costs, and the narratives are not based on objective, falsifiable information, anything like that. The narrative is based on what we believe is the best, right? We believe this to be best. It's not provable. We can't falsify anything. All we can do here is say we believe this to be the best, right? And so that's where we find ourselves now, is that as the Christian influence has waned, the academic rigor of certain institutions, Harvard or Yale, they've just been turned into institutions where thoughts and ideas are valued not because they are in the pursuit of truth. Thoughts and ideas are valued because the individual holds them, and that if the individual holds them, then they must be valuable.
Yeah. And you have to, that's where an idea like sincerity comes into play.
Sure.
Sincerity and authenticity. So that's actually the tagline here, is that the first digital liturgy is authenticity. Now you find this in religious conversations where the idea is it doesn't matter what someone believes as long as they believe it sincerely. And the easy answer is like Hitler seemed to believe sincerely what he believed. Now you go, well, that's just way far afoul. But first off, we know that a sincere belief in Christianity and a sincere belief in Islam cannot intersect, because what one deems as holy, the other deems as blasphemous.
Right.
What one deems as the crux of the argument, the crucifixion and resurrection of Christ, the other deems as the only sin that can be committed, which is creating partners with the one singular God. And so you have to be able to say, well, you can't sincerely believe in both of those. Someone has to be incorrect, or both of them have to be incorrect. But in an authenticity, sincerity world, we don't weigh things like that. We say, okay, well, Chris seems to sincerely believe what he believes. Josh seems to sincerely believe what he believes. But even then, the gatekeeping does have things you can't sincerely believe.
Right.
And so it's just kind of this mismatch of the individual can believe whatever they want according to their own thought unless it's out of line.
Correct.
And that's functionally disjunctive.
Right.
It doesn't make sense. And I want to talk about this idea of democratization, because I don't think it's all bad. I think there's some goodness to it. But here's where James talks about democratization. Democratization. Wow,
Democratization. Yeah, you're fine.
I should take a language class.
Josh, however you want to pronounce it is correct, right? Just be sincere.
The web empowers us to overcome the limits of our bodies in the natural world. Through the power of the web, we can charge right through the barriers of space, time, and physical givenness. Importantly, the web doesn't care whether a person is rich or poor, white or black, tall or short, male or female, famous or anonymous, incarcerated or free. The codes and algorithms that deliver the web to the world do not discriminate. If you have the right technology, you can see, do, and become whatever you want. The word for this, so of all of the web's achievements, one of its greatest is the sheer freedom of access to information. The word for this is called democratization. It's literally the process of democracy, or the process by which democracy emerges. So when we say that the web has democratized information and experiences, we mean it has made things that otherwise would be available only to few, available to the many.
Sure.
Now, let's pause for a second and say, what's good about that? What's good about the democratization of information?
Yeah, I mean, I think it goes back to what I just alluded to with the Reformation, or the biblically Christian conception of how truth works, right? Truth is true because it's true. It's not true because somebody's decided it's true. It's true because it is true, all right? So what the democratization of information has done...
that, by the way.
Yeah, well, there we go. I have degrees in government, so democratization is part of that. So as that has proliferated, what it's provided is people are given the opportunity to encounter facts, right? Encountering facts is a good thing, which is why as Christians, we would say, and you look at the founding of our country, the heavy Christian influence, people will look at like the First Amendment and say things like, well, see, it says, no state church. Like, well, totally agree with you. Totally agree with you. We don't want a state church because we don't believe that the state is ruling over the church, and that's what the founders intended. But baked into that with the idea of the First Amendment is this freedom of speech that we want, because we want the freedom for people to encounter facts and to recognize that the individual is created with dignity. God has created the individual with dignity, and within the state's purpose is not to dictate thought, because it's impossible to dictate a conscience. It's impossible to dictate a conversion, right? This is something the Lord does. The Lord converts. The Lord saves people. And the founders fully knew with the heavy Christian influence that the purpose of a state religion was to control thought. It wasn't necessarily to see people come to know Christ. It wasn't for that. It was to control thought and to ensure that the state's particular brand of religion was preserved, which is why you go to the 17th century in Britain, you think like, oh, okay, well, clearly a very Christian culture. Well, there were thousands of biblical Christian ministers who were ejected from their pulpits in the Great Ejection because they didn't agree with the state church. So all of this going back to how the web...
Not exactly democracy.
No, not at all, not at all. And so that's literally like 100 years in the background from when the founders have decided, all right, we're going to put this Constitution together and how the individual's rights are preserved, what the Christian wants to see, we don't want to see false information proliferated, but we want to see facts encountered, because we believe that when Jesus says he is the way, the truth, and the life, and when Jesus says, that his words are true and all, like, okay, then let Jesus' words stand on their own and have the individual encounter that. The worst possible thing that we could see happen for somebody is, of course, to have the access to the information prohibited, right? I mean, we don't want that happening, and so we want people to have access to the truth. Now, obviously, people can go off the rails all over the place.
Yeah.
But what's interesting is you look at how the United States functioned, at least morally, for its first 200 years of existence, basically, or 150 years of existence, is that there was incredible amounts of, there was conflict, to be sure, but the morality of this country was much different. It was much more positive morality than ever been experienced in most other countries, primarily because people were given the space to encounter truth and for the freedom of thought to actually interact, so that as people encountered ideas and the Christian gospel proliferated, people's lives were changed by it. And so as Christians, we want to advocate for that, because we know the alternative to have freedom of thought squashed is to say, well, don't encounter this which sets you free. Right?
Yeah. We're pro dissemination of ideas so that God's truth can be seen as the most beautiful. This democratization, it leads to a leveling of expertise. I think a lot of people might think of the COVID-19 pandemic when they think about expertise, and how expertise, was a mess of who is the expert, right? And I think that's actually one of the key pressures of the modern age is not only who is an expert, but what type of expert. How is the expert trained? I think about theologically. If you say, "Hey, Josh, I'm reading a theology professor with a PhD," I want to know where the PhD is from and where they're currently a professor at, because it's not just the expertise that matters; it matters the training
where they're coming from.
There. Because a PhD in theology from Princeton is very different than a PhD in theology from Southern Baptist.
Right.
But they both mean PhD. But now the individual is pressured with knowing the difference.
Right.
And so here is a fundamental just trapping. It's like, okay, Chris, you have information at the ready. You can chart your own course. You can weigh all the facts, but you also don't know all the backgrounds of the people that you're weighing expertise-wise. So there's that problem, but then that can lead us to not value expertise at all, and not, like, for instance, I don't know a tenth of the stuff you know about government. I just don't.
Sure.
So for me to have any intelligent debate with you about political science would be foolish.
Virtually impossible. Yes.
Yeah, because you have more expertise.
Sure.
Now, that expertise is not just intellectual. I know you as a person, and that's helpful. But James points out that offline, outside of the internet, a person's advanced degree, their years of experience, their endorsement by a respected institution, they create a distinction between the value of that person's opinion and the value of an average person.
Sure. Yep.
Right?
Yep.
And so what we've seen is a pendulum swing where the expertise only matters if they already agree with me, and I can say a PhD agrees with me.
Right.
But really, it's agreeing with me that's the fundamental starting principle. He says the web is, in a very real sense, a credential erasing environment. Online, it doesn't matter so much who you are, what you've accomplished, or how much you know. What matters is your truth. What matters is your story. He goes on to talk about the idea of stories, and Oprah Winfrey saying that speaking your truth is the most powerful tool we all have.
Dr. Oprah Winfrey.
The plot to every Disney film, the subtext of every hit song, and the foundation of much of our social and political movements is your story, the story of the individual, right? He says when people criticize a historical biblical doctrine by relating a story, okay, this happens a lot. People criticize a historic biblical doctrine by relating a story of how they were treated poorly by someone. They're almost certain to be flooded with replies offering support and encouragement because the story is more important. It couldn't be that the story is actually of bad actors, but a good doctrine.
Right.
He goes on to say, responding to a person's story with an argument is in the world of the web a fundamental category error. Arguments belong to the world of expertise. Stories belong to the world of democratization. So there's these poles that we want to avoid. One pole is the elite class of intellectuals that are gatekeepers and no one else can have information.
Right.
But the other pole is there's no experts and everyone is on their own. And I mean, we could argue about this all day, but I think, Chris, I feel an an immense pressure on the left pole, or I guess the left for my hand, which is the everyone's an expert.
Sure. Yep.
Because I just know that I can't be.
Right.
During COVID, man, I know a decent bit about the Bible, but that's my lane.
Right.
When it comes, I already told you earlier this podcast, when I have a psychological thought, I got to ask somebody.
Right.
When there's a governmental ruling, I got to ask somebody.
Right.
When there's a thought about epidemiology, I got to ask somebody. I don't have in myself the ability to know, not even all things.
Sure.
Most things.
Sure. Yep.
I can be really good in one or two.
Or to know them with the genuine confidence of somebody who's actually trained in that information. I think that's an important thing, because it shows humility to recognize that you're not an expert.
There was a Twitter thing that went around. It was like, name 5 things you could talk about for 15 minutes without any preparation. Theology is easy, probably health and fitness. And I'm drawing a blank after that. So if you're asking...
Journalism, Josh. Come on. You're an expert.
I'm an observer.
You're a credentialed expert.
Yeah.
You have a credential.
Okay, so journalism would be
You're
3.
a hilltopper.
But when it comes to the things that I could off the cuff be knowledgeable about, it's actually really limited. And yet the web yells at me, you should be an expert on everything. And that's something, I don't know if you felt this, Chris, like I have to be humble enough if someone asks me a question that I'm not an expert in, just go, hey, that's not my lane.
Yeah. I
can try to point you to an ethics guy I know,
right.
or to this guy.
Or we can figure it out together by looking at good sources, right?
But maybe the average Christian feels that way too, that they're expected immediately to have an expert opinion on everything that's happening with Israel, with the border, with all these different things. I got to be an expert, and it's just too much pressure for us.
Yeah.
So maybe that's a clue in for some of us, is just say, I don't even want that kind of pressure. Try to see if there's anything. I mean, there's way more here. Let's end on a Bible thought, Chris. Just how you have seen or what you would warn against in terms of taking your truth, your experience. Let's say you're in a Bible study. Where might you see that my truth, my story come out in reading the Bible?
Yeah, I mean it's a classic example, and this is something I'm sure I've said many times in my younger Christian years in leading Bible studies and everything. But people ask things like, "What does this passage mean to you?" Now it's well-meaning. Right, it's a well-meaning question. Nobody's trying to load that with some type of subjective worldview, undermining the authority of the Bible. But we need to be careful that we ask the question first of what does this mean? Right? Like, so you can ask the question, what does this mean? And then you can give an answer based on what you may believe it to mean. But then you need to open that up for discussion, right? The question needs to be open to say, all right, does it actually mean this? Does this actually mean what you think it means, or do you need to be corrected? And I think the idea of correction is such a dirty idea in our culture right now, because why would you need to be corrected if what you think is true? Mm-hmm. Always, right? Like if you think it's true, the only time it's not true is if the powers that be tell you that you shouldn't think that way, right? And so, somebody can and this is just the insanity. I saw the other day about how the Europe is now walking back. It's generalized the ideas of transgender theory. Yeah. Europe's walking it back now, saying like, well, actually, this isn't really based on any scientific principles. Well, the United States is forging full speed ahead now, right? Yeah. And so people are like coming to some conclusions that it's not sustainable to actually live culturally with the idea that whatever you think and feel is actually to be held on to. But for the Christian, like, all right, well, we might look outside and say, all right, well, non-Christian people, he's transgender, whatever. But we have to be really careful that we look at ourselves and say, like, okay, are you deriving your thoughts about God, the most important being in the universe, your thoughts about who he is and about the church, about the Christian life, are you deriving that based on bad experience you've had? Are you deriving it on ideas that you just decided? I mean, one of the things that I think of, we're in Romans 9 right now in our men's group in Stevens Point, and we're going through. It's a very hard passage because it talks about some very challenging concepts, theological concepts. And one of the things I told the guys a couple weeks ago, I said, like, look, if you open your discussions with me theologically by saying, I don't think I could believe in a God that's like ... I'm not going to listen to you. Like, I'll listen to you with compassion and sympathy, but you're not going to win my hearing on a rational level, because I don't care what you think you can believe. A lot of people think a lot of things. I care about what's actually true.
I don't think I could believe in a God that's 3 and 1.
Right, exactly. Right. And I mean,
usually you can take it to a doctrine that we actually all believe and apply that same principle. It's like, well, okay, you do believe things you don't think you could believe.
Yeah, Charles Taze Russell starts Jehovah's Witnesses by saying, I don't think I can believe in a God that would send anybody to hell. Yeah. And so you concoct an entire system. It's like, well, hold on. Like, there are a lot of people that might agree with you, but does that make it true? So for the Christian, we need to look at Scripture objectively first and then how it applies to us.
And here's where it's helpful, Chris, not to just think about those people out there, but us in here. I use that in preaching as like, okay, if we're going to think about the gross example out there, let's think about how the threading comes into our own hearts. So probably people listening to this podcast are not sitting in Bible studies going, doesn't matter what the Bible means, just what does it mean to you?
Right.
But it might subtly be that you're still stuck in what I think or what you think, and not actually that the whole purpose is what does it say, right? And to be fair and to be helpful, Chris and I, our sermon preparation. I mean, how many times, Chris, do you have an inkling on Monday that's wrong on Wednesday? And it's like, I'm going to go here on the passage, and you read a commentary, and you're like, that was a hunch, that was wrong. And I mean, we prove ourselves wrong 3 or 4 times throughout the week before we get to our preaching on Sunday. It's not like, at least for me, I don't approach the text and go, definitely don't know the main point, all the questions are wrapped up. But we have to be able to not just hold on to the initial thing. So there's a humility in saying, even in community, that together as the body of Christ, not that we're experts, but together as the body of Christ, we have a greater chance at discerning the facts together through processing information, unearthing truth, and relying on brothers and sisters who maybe do have different experiences, right? That experience is good if it's a secondary principle.
Correct.
And I think that we can keep that in mind. The last thing I would say is we just got to be aware of what's at stake when we change our minds. So in a culture that online teaches us that your story and your truth are tied to you, to change your mind means a radical
personality shift, individual shift, right? Yeah.
But we got to think more in terms of God has made me a person. I like what you said earlier. We think about truth for God's sake.
Right.
Now, truth is good for us, right? God's glory and our good are not opposed.
Right.
But we do think about truth first and foremost for God's sake. So if we're wrong for God's sake.
Right.
It's kind of like when Paul says, if we're out of our mind, it's for your sake.
Right.
Man, if we're right for God's sake.
Yep.
If we're wrong for God's sake.
Right.
But we should take seriously how deeply we don't want to be wrong.
Right.
Especially when we're thinking about, we're in Revelation right now. It can be challenging to think, the thing I grew up being taught,
so to actually
Chris
say
and Josh
this?
aren't teaching.
Right.
Now, that doesn't mean that I'm slam dunk, I got everything right.
Right.
It just means that it can be, what if what I thought I knew for 20 years is wrong? Well, how much more for the non-believer?
Right.
How much more for the person who thinks they don't need a savior and they're trying to wrestle with, that we should take seriously how hard it is to think I was wrong in our current culture, because Jesus does talk about counting the costs. And we can be able to help people say, I think you're actually thinking about the cost of giving that up more than anything about the prize.
Yeah.
But the prize is so much sweeter.
Yeah.
So that would be another reflection, not just what does it mean to me, but what does it mean, and then how does it apply to me? That's a good way to say it, right?
Yeah. Yep.
What does it mean? How does it apply to me? And then also let's take seriously what it means to change our minds.
Yeah.
And then in humility, if we have to change our minds, to say, I'll be wrong for God's sake.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that's my story, my truth. This is my podcast, my truth. It's also
this is my podcast, my truth, Josh.
Cue pow, Batman sounds. We're punching each other. I hope this was helpful for you. As we've said in the past, we aim to be a helpful podcast, and if we stumble upon being good in the process, then we're satisfied with that. If you found things helpful, selfishly, sometimes it's hard to know if we're actually being helpful. We'd love to hear if there are particular types.
We take gift cards, things like that.
I'll just take a text message.
Take a text.
If there are things that have been helpful about this podcast, things you would like us to do more, things you found beneficial, we'd love to hear from you. Otherwise, we'll talk to you next time on A Time to Think.